Welcome to Cold Case MHS, Monsters and Demons, where real education meets real life. I'm your host, Randy Hubbard.
And I'm your co-host, Lydia Lisko. And we thank you for listening.
Photographs faded, memories grown old, a story entangled, a crime so unfaithful, yet left untold. I'm puzzling.
Welcome to Cold Case MHS. We appreciate you returning to this episode. Again, as we talk about all these cases, one of the things we talk about is victimology. And sometimes it just seems like the people that fall into these bad situations, it's either because of their lifestyle or just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. And unfortunately, I kind of think this one is being in contact with the wrong person at the wrong time. So I'm going to let the students introduce themselves to talk about this case.
Hi, I'm Danya.
I'm Kaylin. I'm Alexa.
I'm Layla.
So tell us a little bit about your guys' case.
So our case has to do with Stacey Colbert, who was 1 year done with graduation at Ohio State. She had her own apartment. She was living alone, and the day of her disappearance, she came home from a night in earlier than you would usually typically think. She came in at around 6 p.m. and she was packing her suitcases for a conference she had the next week in New York. So she was all excited for that. And from then on to when she disappeared, there's very minimal information on what happened. We know that someone came into her apartment, but it seems like they were let into her apartment instead of forcibly entering. And that night, she disappeared for around 3 days. I would say it was a Saturday that she disappeared, or like Sunday morning that she disappeared. And the police enforcement was not contacted until the Tuesday after, when she didn't show up to work. So there was about 2 days there where no one really knew of her whereabouts and nobody noticed that she had actually disappeared. And her body was not found until 6 years later. And at that point, wasn't much left. So it was very difficult to figure out what had actually happened to her.
So when was she in? What year?
This was in 1998.
Okay, so my question was, it seemed like an awful long time for somebody to report her missing. But if you think about the time period, why do you think they didn't turn her in as missing until 4 days later or 3 days later?
Well, texting and calling was not like a regular thing that you would do on a daily basis, so nobody would have contact with her for like 3 days. So I don't think they really thought anything of it when there was no contact. But then once she didn't show up to work, that's when her coworkers knew, like, that's not like her. So that's when they decided to reach out and kind of see what was actually wrong.
So you said that it was unusual for her not to show up to work. What kind of person was she? Was she a very dedicated worker? Tell me a little bit more about who Stacey was as a person.
Stacey was a very dedicated worker. She took pride in a lot of things that she did, and she would not give up, and that shone through her work ethic, and all of her coworkers had amazing things to say about her. And that's one of the reasons why they thought it was so unusual for her not to be there. She was such a light in everything that she was involved in. And all of her friends would totally agree with that.
Yeah. Stacey was like very passionate, and she also, if she wanted something, she would get it. She wouldn't often take no for an answer. Like back in high school, she had a slight learning disability, but she didn't let that stop her. And obviously she graduated high school and graduated OSU. So she was a very straight to the point person, but she was also very charismatic.
What kind of work did she do?
She worked at American Electrical Power, so it's an electric company that she'd been working at for like 6 months before her disappearance.
Could have there been anything with like a customer, a boss, any sort of work tensions there, or was it all pretty smooth sailing?
We never heard of any tension at work because she was like really loved by her boss and all of her coworkers, and there was no customer interactions that we ever heard of that was like kind of unusual. So everything at work seemed to be pretty normal and pretty just a normal work environment.
Yeah, and the night before, that Friday night, she had went out to a bar with some of her coworkers. So she was like good friends with some of her coworkers. It seemed to be that they had a good relationship. And her boss, after her disappearance, was one of the main people that was kind of like spreading posters and advocating for someone to speak up. So it didn't seem like there were many issues at work.
So you said she was pretty social and she was an outgoing person and things like that. Was she someone who would let people get close to her who she really didn't know, or was she pretty guarded until she really got to know you?
I would say that she's a very trusting person. She would trust you and be your friend until you gave her a reason to not trust you. So that's why I feel like it is kind of in character for her, if she was like friends with somebody, to let them into the apartment, even if she didn't know them for years. But if she like had trust for them and was friends with them, I feel like that would be in character to let them in.
She was also very like outgoing and charismatic, so she didn't really have a steady relationship, but she would, casually flirt with a lot of people. So she wasn't one to like, completely shut down people's advances, but obviously she would make what she wanted clear. But yeah, so she was more casual in that sense, which could explain, why she would know more people, especially more men who could have had motive to do something like this.
So I'm curious about Stacey's family. You mentioned that it was her coworkers that reported her missing, and we did say how texting and calling wasn't a huge big thing in the late 90s. How was her relationship with her parents? Did she have any siblings?
So she had a sister named Danielle, and we don't know much about her relationship with her parents, but I know she was close with them when she was younger. But she did grow up in Illinois, so she was further away from her parents when she went to Ohio State. But her sister also went to Ohio State, so they maintained a pretty close relationship, and they would talk often. Like, I know there was some award ceremony or like a movie had just come out, and like they would talk about things like that. So, and I'm pretty sure it was actually Danielle who reported her missing when the coworkers like contacted Danielle about it. So Danielle definitely was concerned and knew that was out of character.
Yeah, so what happened is that Tuesday, that was her second day not coming to work. So Monday she didn't come to work, and Tuesday she also didn't come to work, and that's when her coworkers or her boss found it weird. So they phoned Danielle. They didn't phone the police. So they called Danielle, and Danielle had the night before also called Stacey, but Stacey hadn't picked up the phone. Obviously, Danielle didn't really see this as a huge cause for worry yet. Like, she just assumed Stacey was busy because obviously it was late 1990s. Like, people weren't always on their phone. But then when she gets this call from her coworkers, she starts to get a little more suspicious. And so she ends up going to Stacey's apartment to see if Stacey's there. And when she gets to Stacey's apartment, it's like completely empty. And it also looks like slightly deserted, as in her apartment looked like she kind of left it in a rush. And everything was kind of left where it was, but Stacey was nowhere to be found. And so then that's when Danielle was the one who called the police and filed a missing persons report.
As a matter of fact, when you guys talked about the apartment, one of the things that you talked about was that stuff that was left behind. Talk a little bit more about that stuff that was left behind and what was kind of weird about it.
So in the apartment, there wasn't very many signs of struggle, so it kind of looked like Dania said she just got taken out of the picture. The refrigerator door was left open, and there was like kind of clothes thrown all over the place, but the clothes were most likely because she was going on that trip in a couple of days. So when Danielle saw the apartment, she said that it was kind of like how Stacey was, like she was kind of messy, and it just looked like most likely someone had come to the door and she was in the middle of something and she just went out, and it happened really fast.
Yeah, there were a couple footprints on the door. There was like a male footprint and a female footprint. But other than that, there wasn't any specific evidence showing like struggle or anything had happened. Mostly it was just the fact that everything was left so suddenly. So like Layla said, like the refrigerator the door was left open, and there was like the breadsticks she had ordered the night before, they were kind of just left on the counter half eaten. And all these kind of messier things about the apartment, which made it seem like she had really no time to do anything. Whatever it was that happened must have happened very quickly.
So we've talked a bit about who Stacey was. We've kind of talked about day of. Now, why don't we discuss the police investigation a little bit? Because when you're investigating a disappearance versus a murder, which most often the cold cases that we'll deal with are like a murder first. So tell me if you know how the police handled and what they found during their initial investigation of Stacey's disappearance, and then later when they found the body.
The investigation started off at the Columbus Police Department because that's where Stacey had lived, And they kind of started out by just going down a list of people to talk to that they think would have anything to do with it or know anything about it. So they did talk to some of the neighbors that surrounded Stacey's apartment. So there is a neighbor upstairs. They claimed to have heard noises, like screams and loud noises in the middle of the night of Stacey's disappearance, but they hadn't contacted the police. And the next day, they went down to check on the apartment to see that the door was cracked open and her cat boots had been roaming around, and they just never really contacted the police. And then there's also a next door neighbor that had frequently complained about noise, but also claimed not to hear anything that night. So there's just so their stories are just not really lining up. So I know that they talked to them. They also talked to the pizza delivery worker, and he was cleared as any sort of suspect, but he had said that he felt like Stacey wasn't alone. So he was the last known person to see her alive. But yeah, the Columbus Police Department just kind of went down a list of people trying to talk to.
Yeah, and we couldn't get too much information on what was said in these interviews they conducted, but we do know that some people they were talking to had a little bit of resistance and weren't as willing to talk to them, and so it was kind of difficult for them to really find any helpful information, which is why the case went cold in the first place. But it stayed a missing person case up until her body was found, which was 6 years later in 2004. And so her body was actually found in a different area. It was in Delaware County that her body was found. It was in a farmish area, kind of in the middle of nowhere. And a hunter was the one who stumbled across her body accidentally because he was looking for his dog. And he found the remains. It was mostly just bones, and not all the bones were there. Only about 70% of the bones were there. And that's when the Delaware County Police Department got involved. And so the case was transferred to them because that's where the body was found. So they tried to pick up on all the old leads because obviously now it became a murder case. It's been so long since the initial incident that a lot of things they could have maybe investigated might have gone cold, or they didn't get to investigate the case initially as a murder case, which affected a lot of the evidence they were able to obtain.
So the big thing about missing person cases versus true homicides that occur right away is that you have leads, but unfortunately until you find a body or you find that person, a lot of times those leads just kind of disappear. Tell us a little bit about the area she lived in. You were talking about she lived in an apartment, there was somebody above her and things like that. She just graduated college. So was she still part of the college atmosphere, college town?
Yes, in a way. She was still part of the college group. She would talk to all her friends that she had during the sorority house, and she would go and visit the sorority house when she had time to. She also made sure she kept in contact with some of her friends that she had who we were actually able to talk to for our presentation. She was just very close with the sorority house, and there was no issues with anybody with the sorority house.
Okay, so their apartment, if it was close to that, and you talked about the neighbor heard screams and things like that.
Apartment was also really close to the Ohio State campus,
okay.
So she wasn't that far removed from the college atmosphere at all, and it was downtown Columbus.
Okay, so that was kind of my point about that, is that those people that said they heard screaming and things like that, unfortunately, and I know this sounds bad, but when you're in a college town on a weekend, a lot of times people are having parties, friends over, things like that. I think for them to say that they heard that but didn't do anything is not necessarily that they did it on purpose. You know what I mean? Because a lot of times, especially when you live in apartments, you hear weird stuff and people don't get killed. So them not saying anything was not a big deal. I think the one that concerns me a little bit is the one that complained a lot but didn't all of a sudden didn't hear anything. So did they rule that person out, or?
There was never really a clear, we ruled them out. But it was just kind of okay, let's keep this person in mind. We know this doesn't really add up, but I don't think they ever really came to this person did it. That was never really an option.
Okay, so I do kind of have a little bit of an odd question. We mentioned that Stacey's apartment was just left like it was abandoned, and there are some cases where sometimes people just get up and leave, and there was no malicious intent involved. Do you know if the police believe that this was a case where she just got up and left, or because of the evidence and the pizza guy saying there was definitely someone with her, do you think they tended to treat it more intensely because of those factors, or do you think they thought, oh, she just got up and left?
I mean, there was nothing in her history that would suggest she would be the type of person to get up and leave. Like, she never tried to run away from home. She was very happy with where she was, and everyone around her, like her sister Danielle, was very concerned. So I think when police were confronted with the fact that, like, you know, Danielle thought this was unusual, nothing Stacey has done had pointed to a situation like this, it was kind of out of character for her to do something like that, which is why the missing persons report was probably taken a little more seriously. I obviously don't know the police's actual intentions. That's kind of just my opinion on who she was. I think they just treated it as a missing persons report.
Also, her apartment, while there weren't many signs of struggle, there were a few things that were alarming to the police. The apartment smelled strongly of bleach, and there was a boot print on the inside of the door and a small handprint on the floor, like right in front of the door. So it had been it kind of looked like someone had tried to grab her and like kick the door closed. So there was just a few little things like that that made it seem like something had happened, and it wasn't like she just left.
We've kind of talked about the case a lot. I want to know a bit more about your guys' process. You said that you talked to some of her friends. Were you guys able to get any information from the police departments, any autopsy reports, anything like that?
So really we started with talking to a lot of Stacey's friends, and we also reached out to her sister, and we wanted to know more about like who Stacey was. That was our first goal. So we talked a lot about her life in the sorority house and just kind of what person she was in high school and in college. So that was definitely our first step, is to find all of them. And then we were able to talk to Captain Kevin Savage at the Delaware County Police Department, and we were never able to get an autopsy report, and we weren't able to disclose any like evidence that they had found, but we were able to get a little more information and kind of like clarify some things that we had seen online.
So were they able to determine how she was killed?
There was no official determination of how she was killed, which is why, like, we don't know if there even was an autopsy report. We tried to reach out about that, but we never really got an answer. So we don't have the autopsy report. But I think when we were talking to Captain Savage, he said most likely she got strangulated without breaking her hyoid bone, which is the bone that usually breaks when someone chokes you.
And I know that when the skeletal remains were found, like the hyoid bone was not found. So there's no way we could really like clarify that. But there were no like other markings on the bone that were concerning, and like her remains were identified through dental records. So not a lot was really found of that.
My next question is, do you know if her family and friends, were they continuously fighting for her case to keep on looking at over the 6 years that she was missing?
Her sister runs a social media page on Facebook, I think, and Instagram, Fighting for Stacey, updating like every so often like about Stacey's case and everything, and trying to get information about Stacey. And a bunch of her friends are also like behind the scenes for that as well. But her family like has like kept like updating like certain like social media platforms and like to get information out of people if like somebody knows something about Stacey's case, or if like for like our instinct if somebody like brings in Stacey's case up again to the police or talks about it again, to like put that on like the social media platforms and make sure that people still know that Stacey's case is still unsolved.
Her mom kind of stays out of the picture now. Her dad, I believe, is deceased, but her sister Danielle doesn't directly run the social media pages, but she does coordinate a lot with Paula, who is one of Stacey's sorority sisters and like the main person behind the social media pages. And I know during those 6 years where she was missing, obviously they didn't really have like social media like that. So what they did initially instead was they put up a bunch of posters all around OSU, and I know they even got American Electrical Power to put up posters as well. And they also held a vigil for Stacey a couple months after her disappearance, or maybe a year after her disappearance, on the OSU campus. So even without social media, initially they were spreading the word out a lot.
And I know that they also have a GoFundMe linked on a lot of their social medias to hire a private investigator. If anyone wants to go check that out, that would be helpful.
Often when we're working with these cases, it can be very difficult to get information from the police. It's going to be hard to find family and friends. What have you guys learned from this experience, and what do you think you're going to take with you now that it's finished?
I would say just like talk, like, don't be afraid to reach out to these people and talk to them. And a lot of times, while you may feel like people are going to be sensitive and worried about it, most of the times they're grateful that you are willing to talk to them and continue getting information on their case out there.
Yeah, and I would also say, like, definitely don't underestimate how much information you can get from friends and family, because I know a lot of people want to go, like, straight to the police department, but oftentimes the police department is busy, which is, like, completely understandable. But in our case, like, really it was mostly Stacey's friends who helped us understand who Stacey was and the entire case itself, honestly. So I feel like that was something I took away from this. And also kind of what Layla was saying, people were so grateful to us that we were bringing this case back up again, and it just showed how much people, like, truly cared about Stacey and still want to see her case solved even after, like, 20 years.
It definitely was really inspiring to see how much her family and friends really care about, like, getting justice for her. So I definitely, like, think that talking to them, like, really kept us fighting for Stacey as well, seeing how much they really cared about her.
Well, I think one thing is that some families kind of want to move on. Others, especially in situations like this where she disappeared and nobody knows exactly why she disappeared or how she was killed, sometimes they just want somebody to keep the story out there. I think Paula was extremely grateful for your work that you did on this. She's still in contact with us, and I have a feeling I'm going to be in contact with her for a while. Talk a little bit about, you talked about information getting from them. The police didn't give you a whole lot. We knew that was probably going to be the case. Now, they did talk to you and let you ask questions and things like that. And I think sometimes asking questions and getting the answers, they can't answer that. Sometimes tells you what the answer is. So can you give an example of that with Detective Savage, where you asked something and he kind of said, I really can't talk about that, which kind of gave us an idea that we were on the right track?
I think we did give him a name that we were kind of suspecting, a name that had come up in some conversations that we had with some people. And when we said that name, he kind of went silent and just said, like, I cannot disclose that information to you. So that definitely led us down the right path of our research. We can't really say the name of this person, but their name can be found in multiple podcasts that have been done about Stacey's case.
So do you think that your investigation process has led to potential more, like, suspects and another opening in Stacey's case that could eventually lead it to get solved?
I think so. I think we've been able to gather, like, a lot of information on this person and just kind of be more aware of the possibilities that could come of it and kind of, like, putting all the pieces together of why it kind of makes sense.
I don't think we found any new leads. We were more so just investigating a lead that some of Stacey's friends had suspected. So I wouldn't say we found any, let's say, like, completely new information that led us to a different person, but we did discover more about this person. And also our goal with this entire presentation and project at the end of the day was to get the case back out there. And especially in our case, it was to have this person that we were maybe suspicious of see that there are still people who care about this case and who are still putting it out and who are still actively searching for who did it.
Do you guys think there's anything that we haven't already discussed that you want to mention in the podcast?
I was going to say, when we talked to Delaware County and Captain Savage, he did tell us that we kind of asked him, you know, what he thought of the crime scene, what their initial thoughts were, and this kind of confirmed also what we were thinking because he was able to outright say these things. So he told us they definitely suspected it was someone she knew because of the no forced entry, and they also are pretty sure it was a male just because circumstantially it would make the most sense. I mean, she would have to be taken out of her apartment somehow because there was not enough evidence to assume that it happened in her apartment. And even so, I mean, even if it did happen in her apartment, she was still transported out of it, which would require, like, a heavier build. Plus, given the fact that she was maybe more flirty, there was more motive for a guy who, let's say, wanted more out of his relationship with her than she did. there was more motive for someone like that to do this than any motive we could find for a woman she knew.
And also considering there was a male boot print on the inside of the door also leads us to believe that it was a male.
There's also the possibility that someone else knew about it and that, like, the person that did it called someone to come and help them. Because, like, if this person took her and then they cleaned the apartment right away and it was in the night, so they probably needed help getting her out of the building.
Well, one thing that I noticed during your presentation, which I didn't catch previously when you were doing this, is that you mentioned the night she went out with her coworkers. And she was taken home by somebody. And supposedly she was upset. And that individual stayed there for a while. I know that it was a different night, but what did we discuss about that individual?
Yeah, so we got more information about that and found out that, I think I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but she had gone out to a bar the night before and she had gotten into a fight with one of her friends. I mean, not like a serious fight, but she was kind of upset over that fight. So instead of maybe her friend taking her home, one of her other coworkers took her home. It was like this older male. And he was kind of comforting her on the way home. And apparently he also stayed in her apartment for like half an hour, continually comforting her. What we talked about when we found out this information is we definitely thought it was a little suspicious, because if he stayed for half an hour in her apartment, he could kind of map out the layout of her apartment in case, you know, even though it was the day before, it could have been a sort of like planning type thing where he wanted to know what the apartment looked like in case he was going to come back again.
Or even if he's there comforting her, what kind of signals could she have possibly given him that he would return?
I mean, maybe he thought that she was kind of interested in him in a romantic way, and he could have come back the next day, and then she was like, no, like, I'm not interested in you that way, and that could have led to some feelings of passion and, like, frustration from being rejected or something like that.
Now, this is all speculation. We're not
Yes.
accusing that person of doing that. They may have had nothing to do with her after that night anyway. So it's just, I think it's something that maybe needed to be looked at. And I don't know if the police have looked into that. Detective Savage actually has been really good about helping us at least work through these things. And I know that he complimented the work that you guys did on it and the thought that you put behind the questions, even though we couldn't answer all of them. I do know that they're reevaluating or restructuring their cold case unit, and they have reevaluated several cases. And I think Stacey's is one of those that they're going to look at again just to go through. And part of that is just because we brought it back up. And I think that's the biggest thing that we're trying to get out of this, is just getting that information back out and poking the bear a little bit. Hey, that there's other people that, you know, are interested in this. So I think you've done your job, and I think you've done it really well. Is there anything that you guys want to put out there more about the case or about the website?
Or if anyone has any information about Stacey's case, who should they contact? Where should they go?
If you have any information about Stacey's case at all, you can contact the Delaware County Police Department, or Finishing Stacey's Fight. You can contact them through Facebook, Instagram. They even have a TikTok, or you can email cold case email.
Finishing Stacey's Fight also has an email. It's just finishingstaceysfight@gmail.com. So it's the same as all their socials. And I think Alexa mentioned earlier, but they also have a GoFundMe linked in all of their bios that would help hire a private investigator.
And our email is coldcase@masonohioschools.com. Thank you for all the work you did. We really appreciate that. I'm sure Stacey and her family appreciate everything you've done. Thank you for listening to our podcast, and we will see you again next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cold Case MHS.
This podcast was edited by the students of Cold Case MHS and produced by Mr. Hubbard and myself. The music was performed and written by Alexa Dahl, and the artwork was created by the students of MHS Design Studio Internship.
Please consider sharing this podcast to bring more light to these victims. Tune in next time to Cold Case MHS, Monsters and Demons.
Photographs faded, memories grown old, a story entangled, a crime so unfaithful, yet left untold. A puzzle in the dark, we will find that spark. They have left their mark. Victims in memory, let's find the enemy. We won't leave it be. Behind every shadow, a story to be told. Of lives that were special, but some hearts have grown cold. In the depths of the darkness, a flicker of hope remains.